Welcome to On the Moneyline, a podcast by MMA Play 365. I'm Newsome, and I'm here to break down UFC Vegas 99, which goes down this weekend on Saturday night, coming off a really good event actually last weekend at the Apex. And of course, once this event's done, we've got UFC 308 in Abu Dhabi, which will be at a good time, I believe, for the UK and European MMA fans. So, yep, looking forward to getting this one out of the way and then jumping on to next week. Really looking forward to that card. Topuria and Holloway headlining. It's a phenomenal main event, but we've got a card to deal with here first. And the card's okay. I think, half of the card I'm really looking forward to. The other half of the card, maybe not so much. But hopefully, just from a viewing perspective and an entertainment perspective, all we're wanting is some good fun fights, which I think even some of the fights that I'm not looking forward to has got the potential of being somewhat entertaining. So as always, look, I'll always be positive about these cards. I love MMA. I love the UFC. I love watching fights. So that's where I am more often than not. But just before we get into those breakdowns, as always, if you want to jump into the action this weekend, then you can do so at MMAplay365.com. We're coming off a good event last weekend. We made some money. The parlays were decent. The recommended bets was 3 out of 4. Bayes AI, I believe, was 9 out of 12 as well, correct? So that's great. And also from my perspective, I hit a bet that not many people were siding with in Pat Sabatini. A lot of people were going the other way in Jonathan Pearce. So, yeah, all in all, a good event last weekend. And if you want to jump into the action this weekend, then like I say, hit up MMAplay365.com. We've got something for every type of gambler, whether you're a fun gambler that wants to hit the long shot parlays, whether you're a gambler yourself that just wants to use the service to potentially back up your own thoughts and your own opinions. We've got a recommended bet section for you guys with full written breakdowns, and we've got an official bet section if you just want to follow and tail the bets that I place with my own money. And then of course every single subscription comes with Bayes AI, our UFC prediction software that will give you a percentage prediction for every possible outcome of every UFC fight at every UFC event. One more time, that's MMAplay365.com. And that's that. The introduction's out the way. The promo is out the way. Let's get breaking down some fights. And in the main event, we've got a 5-round fight in the UFC middleweight division. And I absolutely love this fight. I love it more that it's 5 rounds as well. We've got Michel Pereira versus Anthony Fluffy Hernandez. Now, from a style versus style perspective, this is probably, I wouldn't say as binary actually, but it is pretty binary from a style versus style perspective, because we've got Michel Pereira that's going to absolutely want to keep this fight on the feet standing, where he's got power, he's got athleticism, he's knocking people out since he's come up to middleweight. I think that actually is a really good talking point, because down at welterweight he clearly struggled with the weight cut. It was clearly a huge weight cut, a little bit like Alex Pereira, to be fair. When he was at middleweight, he had to move up to light heavyweight just because the weight cuts were killing him. And I do think it had an effect on Michel Pereira's performances as well, not in a massive way, but I definitely think that he couldn't be who he wanted to be inside the cage because of the tough weight cut, because he had to sort of manage the expenditure of energy, whereas up at middleweight, the weight cut's not as brutal, so he can focus more on his skill set, focus more on improving, rather than, just trying to cut weight the entire camp. And then, of course, inside the cage as well, he's going to have extra energy to spend, so it's perfect for him. And since he's moved up to middleweight, like I say, he's just looked like an absolute wrecking machine. Obviously, the powers seems to have doubled with his size doubling, or with the lack of the weight cut. So for Michel Pereira, it was a perfect move. And like I say, he's looked like an absolute monster. But on the other side, we've got Anthony Fluffy Hernandez, who is absolutely not going to want to stand and strike in this fight. He's going to want to wrestle, grapple, get Pereira down to the mat, try and choke him, or if he can't choke him or finish him via submission, then, just grind the minutes away of the rounds and, look great from a dominant MMA wrestling perspective. And even Hernandez, similar thing to Pereira, apart from the weight move. Like, Hernandez came into the UFC and he looked okay and he looked well-rounded, but didn't look like he was potentially a fighter that is going to surge up into the rankings. But, he's on a winning streak now himself, and he's looked great. His style has changed from that all-round type of style to heavy wrestling, heavy grappling, and to the point where he's relentless with it. And it's MMA grappling as well, which is exactly the type of grappling that you want for mixed martial arts, because look, Hernandez doesn't have that extensive NCAA D1 wrestling background, but what he has is that tricky MMA wrestling. And there's a difference between the two, because these NCAA D1 wrestlers at some point have to bridge a gap between the wrestling and, bringing that into the striking and into MMA. Whereas if you've got a good MMA wrestling base, if you've learned wrestling within the MMA setting, then that gap's already bridged for you, because that's what you've learned. So from Anthony Hernandez's perspective, he's a really good wrestler. He's a really good grappler. Now, when it comes to this specific matchup, I think that, again, I know it's cliche, but it is going to be super competitive over 5 rounds. I definitely think both fighters are going to have the moments. I do think Pereira's going to get taken down at some point in this fight, but this is the other thing, like, Pereira's got good takedown defense. Now, you could argue that he's not fought anybody as relentless as Anthony Hernandez in regards to that wrestling, in regards to the pressure wrestling, the takedown attempts, but he's still got a very good takedown defense percentage. I'm sure it's like 93% or something like that. It's high. And even from a grappling perspective, we don't see it a lot, but Pereira's got BJJ as well. So I don't think Hernandez is going to absolutely steamroll him in regards to just completing takedowns every time he shoots, or if he does get Pereira down, I just don't think he's going to spend a lot of time on top of Pereira. I think if and when that happens, it'll be Hernandez shooting takedowns constantly for 3 rounds, and then suddenly Pereira's now a little bit tired, and then the takedowns are coming a little bit easier. The topside grappling is becoming a little bit longer. But I just don't know whether Pereira's going to get to that stage where he's tired, or even get to that stage where he's constantly being taken down, because even outside of the takedown defense and the get-up game with the jiu-jitsu, Pereira's absolutely huge. Like, big, powerful, strong, and that's always a first line of takedown defense before any of the technical defensive wrestling kicks in or defensive grappling kicks in. That first line of defense, if you're strong, big, strong, powerful, is just being able to, make your opponent work. And I think that's what's going to happen. I think Hernandez is going to have to work a little bit harder than he normally does. We have seen him slow down in some rounds as well. So, like, when you go back to the Josh Fremd fight, Hernandez dominated round 2, then round 2 flipped on its head, and then he came back in round 3. So we've seen Anthony Hernandez potentially have to take rounds off to save his energy if he's overshooting, and I think that might be what happens here. I think he's going to have to work extra hard to take Pereira down. I do think the takedowns are going to come. But on the feet, when Hernandez isn't shooting, Pereira is so dangerous, so athletic. Hernandez is going to have to be careful of knees coming up the middle, potentially flying knees as well. But also just the punches that Pereira lands. I just don't think Hernandez is going to have too much of an answer on the feet for Pereira. I think Pereira is going to potentially light him up. I think he's got a ton of power. And that's the other thing. Like, I mentioned the first line of defense with the wrestling being your physical attributes, your power, your strength. But every time Hernandez comes into range, if he's getting hit by bombs from Pereira, or not even bombs, just like jabs, like, you can tell even a jab has got so much behind it for Pereira, it could make Hernandez hesitant from really closing the distance and trying to shoot in, and there Pereira can therefore, come on a little bit stronger. But I do think Hernandez is going to get into range. I do think he's potentially going to get a couple of takedowns, but I think he's going to have to work so hard for them. I think that if Pereira can just keep standing back up and then making Hernandez work that double time each time Hernandez tries to shoot in, I think that's going to wear more on Hernandez than it is Pereira. Now, over 3 rounds, I'd probably be a bit more unsure, because it's 3 rounds and Hernandez might only need to do it for 2, but can Hernandez do that for 5 rounds if he's having to work overtime trying to take Pereira down and then getting smashed in between in regards to, Pereira landing hard shots within the striking? I do think that, look, the easier prediction here is picking Hernandez just to roll through Pereira, get takedown after takedown after takedown, and completely nullify him. But I just think there's going to be more to this fight than that. I think the striking's going to play a bigger part than what some might think. And for those reasons, I'm picking Michel Pereira to win this fight. And in the next fight, we've got a good co-main event here, actually. We've got Rob Font versus Kyler Phillips. Now, it's Kyler Phillips that's stepping up in competition here to fight Rob Font, and it's a step up well-deserved. And it's one of these fights where, look, first and foremost, I think the betting line, like as I'm looking at it now, there's places that have got Rob Font at like a plus 300 underdog, which I just think is way, way too wide. You know, I kind of get... in a way, I definitely understand Kyler Phillips being the favourite, but I just think the line's way too wide. I don't think there's going to be any value on Kyler Phillips at this current betting line. Of course, obviously, if you're playing the fun parlay side of things, then yeah, obviously Kyler Phillips will be a parlay piece for you. But I think if you're playing the long-term game to get value from the bookie to beat the bookie long-term, yeah, I don't think there's any value in Kyler Phillips. Now, like I say, it's a line that I think is too wide. It's a step up in competition for Kyler Phillips, but the thing is, even though it's a step up in competition, I kind of feel like he's getting Rob Font here with Font on his way down. It's not as if Rob Font's been in and around the top 3 to 5 and is still winning fights there. He's on a bit of a win streak, and then now Kyler Phillips is stepping up to face that type of fighter. This is a fighter in Rob Font that's been around the top, done what he's needed to do, and now, as he's probably on a little bit of a decline, at least from a durability perspective, in my opinion, he's coming back down the division, and then he's meeting Kyler Phillips as Phillips is coming up. So it's a bit of a meeting when one fighter's on the way up versus one fighter that's on the way down. And Kyler Phillips is a bit of a strange one for me personally, because when he came into the UFC, I wasn't high on him. Then after a couple of fights, I was super high on him. Cashed a couple of bets. I cashed him as an underdog against Song Yadong, which, again, I think that's a fight that's probably going to get run back at some point as well. But yeah, I was then super high on Kyler Phillips, and then I started not being so high on him, and now I'm back high on him again. And if for nothing else, that's just a story of how mixed martial arts can go for a fighter's career. It can be up and down, and you can always come back from potentially a loss or a couple of losses. And I think Kyler Phillips now, look, he's off the back of 2 wins against Raoni Barcelos and Pedro Munoz, which is the reason why he's got this fight with Rob Font. I would say Barcelos and Munoz are just a level below Rob Font, and now that's, this is the next logical step for Kyler Phillips. Where a worry for Rob Font is he's predominantly a striker, boxing heavy. He can wrestle, he can grapple, but his boxing's definitely the best part of his game. And I'm just not sure if he can take the pressure and the heat anymore in regards to these fighters at the top of the division. And this is where we're going to find out about Kyler Phillips, because you can't put Kyler Phillips right now in that conversation with, the Jose Aldo or the Marlon Vera. You will if Kyler Phillips comes in here and looks impressive. Also, Davison Figueiredo as well. Figueiredo hit Rob Font and was just too powerful for him, too aggressive for him. And I think Kyler Phillips has some of the same traits as Davison Figueiredo. I obviously don't think he's there yet in regards to the quality of Figueiredo. But again, if Phillips wins here and wins convincingly, then maybe that's a fight that we can look at in the future in regards to Phillips and Davison Figueiredo, because Phillips will be in and around that level of competition. And I kind of feel that, look, with the way that Phillips fights, he is super aggressive. He is on the gas, on the accelerator. He's got power in his hands. I wouldn't say it's like one-punch knockout power, scary power, that type of power, but he's definitely got some power to hurt his opponents. He's got good kicks, but then his grappling's really good. His wrestling is to go with it as well. And I just think, look, Font's gonna land some good, technical boxing on Kyler Phillips. He's going to pop away with a jab. He's going to follow up with the straight right hand. He'll throw a couple of low kicks in there as well. I don't think he'll try and wrestle Phillips. But that's the thing. I feel like Phillips could win a striking fight with Font. Just being on the end of the jab, just being on the end of the 1-2 when he needs to be. But then in between those strikes from Font, it's going to be Phillips that's putting the pressure on, that's forward moving, that's landing, the heavier punches, the combinations. But then with Phillips, he's got a wrestling and grappling path to victory here as well. Now, the concerns that you have with Phillips, and this is the reason why I think the line's too wide in regards to Rob Font being a massive underdog here, is because Phillips hasn't proven it yet with someone like Rob Font. Rob Font has beaten guys that's supposed to beat him, like take Yanez, for example. Yanez was going in there. Everybody thought Yanez was going to smoke Font. Font smoked Yanez, right? Kyler Phillips has shown some cardio issues before when he's stepping on the gas too much. If he does that against Rob Font will make him pay. So these are a couple of the things that I think would put me off from really loading up from Kyler Phillips's perspective. But with that being said, from what I've seen of Rob Font, I think he's on a bit of a decline. I think the durability is definitely a question mark. And I just think Kyler Phillips, if he starts cracking Rob Font and hurts Rob Font, then I think Font's going to start maybe backing down from the exchanges a little bit, and that's just going to help Phillips either continue striking or strike to set up the wrestling and grappling. So I do think Phillips is going to win. There's still a couple of question marks on Phillips at this level, but I think Phillips has got what it takes to beat the current version of Rob Font. So for those reasons, I'm picking Kyler Phillips to win this fight. And in the next fight, we've got the return of Sumudaerji versus Charles Johnson. And I think it's good matchmaking, this. I definitely think it's going to be an entertaining fight. I think it's going to be fun. Johnson's obviously dealt with a few wrestlers and grapplers over the last few fights. And, you've not really been able to see the full extent of, an exciting and entertaining striking battle. But with Sumudaerji is absolutely a striker. So he's going to want to stand and strike. And actually, it wouldn't surprise me if Charles Johnson decided to get the wrestling and grappling going against Sumudaerji, because there's clearly holes in the wrestling and grappling there of Sumudaerji. So although we think we might have a striking fight here and that Johnson's finally not getting a wrestler and grappler, Johnson might just use that to his advantage and then turn into that wrestler and grappler himself. So yeah, I think it's an interesting fight. And just like I mentioned with Kyler Phillips, I've been up and down on Sumudaerji throughout his career as well. Like I wasn't that high on Sumudaerji when he came into the UFC, but then, he's putting some wins together, looking phenomenal, getting knockouts as well, looking dangerous at this weight class. And then suddenly I'm high on him, and then it sort of drops off a cliff a little bit for him. He's on a 2-fight losing streak, and you look at those fights, and it was Tim Elliott, Tim Elliott against someone that's predominantly a striker is going to always be an absolute nightmare. The Matt Schnell one was a little bit more surprising because Sumudaerji had him all types of hurt, and then, suddenly got a bit tired, made a few mistakes grappling, and then Schnell ended up getting him and choking him. So, look, when I actually first saw the betting lines here, and I saw Sumudaerji as a sort of like slight to moderate underdog, instantly I was looking at the Sumudaerji side thinking, well, surely there's going to be value here. But actually looking into the fight, it's tough to find that value in Sumudaerji. I actually think the line is, the odds are lined correctly. Like, I don't see too much value in either side right now. I've got a funny feeling some money is going to come in on Sumudaerji. That would probably give some value on Charles Johnson. But the bottom line is, you look at Sumudaerji's wins in the UFC. He's beaten Andrei Sukumtar, who's not been in the UFC for a long, long time. Then you've got Malcolm Gordon, who is no longer in the UFC and never really did anything in the UFC either. And then the same with Zaruk Adeshev. Zaruk Adeshev, I don't think is in the UFC anymore. If he is, he's not fought for a while, but still, he's not really done anything in the UFC. So the only wins that Sumudaerji's got and has looked great in are the 3 wins where the fighters aren't even with the UFC anymore and didn't look like they were going to stay around for long anyway. I don't mean any disrespect when I'm saying that. It's just they didn't stay in the UFC for very long. So there's a big difference between a win on those 3 fighters and then trying to win against Charles Johnson. Charles Johnson's got good striking, good wrestling, good grappling. And this is why I think he's going to be a bit of a nightmare, because the way Sumudaerji's going to get Charles Johnson here, the way he's going to beat him if he wins is by striking, by landing more volume, by landing power and trying to hurt Charles Johnson. But Johnson's got good durability, he's got good striking himself. I think that if you're looking at a 15-minute kickboxing fight here, I think it's going to be close and competitive. I wouldn't say that Sumudaerji's got this massive edge, but then Johnson's got the wrestling and grappling, which is going to be a big edge here as well. So I think no matter where Johnson goes in this fight, he's got a very good chance of winning. I think if his standing striking doesn't use his wrestling and grappling, I still think he would win that type of fight just by, being... I don't know if he's going to be a little bit faster, but I think he's going to be more physical. I think he'll land some hard shots on Sumudaerji. The striking, look, it is tough to be that confident in Charles Johnson in a 15-minute kickboxing fight with Sumudaerji. I think, like I said, I think the right description is close and competitive, but this is mixed martial arts. And Charles Johnson, I think, if he decides to wrestle and grapple, he can make this a very comfortable night for him, because I think he'll do good work. I think that's where the biggest gap in skill is in this fight, is within those areas, the wrestling and grappling. So, yeah, it's hard to look past Charles Johnson here, specifically because he's so much better in a couple of specific areas, which I've obviously just explained. So, for those reasons, I'm picking Charles Johnson to win this fight. And in the next fight, I think this is going to be super fun. It's one of my favourite fights on the card just because, I love the wrestling and grappling style fights, and we've got a wrestler and grappler versus a wrestler and grappler here, so I do expect to see some fun scrambles. We've got Brady Hiestand versus Jake Hadley. Now, just very quickly from a betting perspective, and I know I'm talking more about a betting perspective inside this episode of the podcast, and actually just on a side note, it is something that I've been considering potentially putting a little bit more into these breakdowns, talking about from a betting perspective where the value might lie. I've done it previously. It didn't really seem to be sort of a fan favourite with that, if you like. But if it is something that you do want to hear more of and you're listening on YouTube, please just drop a reply in the comments and just let me know. But yeah, back to the fight itself. Look, from a betting perspective, I feel like it's going to be one of these fights where the value's on the underdog in Jake Hadley, but the underdog is going to lose. And, we see these fights all the time. Argetta and Cody Haddon was one last week, in my opinion. I thought the value was with Argetta. I bet Argetta myself. I did think that Argetta did have a good stylistic matchup against Cody Haddon, but it was in the back of my mind that it could be one of these fights where the value is on the underdog, and that's the way that I bet the fight, just because, we're in the business of making good bets. So I bet where I thought the value was in Argetta, but I did understand and appreciate that it might be one of these fights where the value's on the underdog, but the underdog just doesn't win. And I kind of feel like this is one of these fights because, look, Jake Hadley, again, he's up in the bantamweight division now. Seems like he might have found his home here after looking great last time out on short notice. And I think with Jake Hadley, look, he's got a good grappling game to make it close with Hiestand, because what Hiestand's going to do, he's going to come in, he's going to wrestle heavily, he's going to try and take his opponents down, and he can literally do this for 3 rounds. He does start getting severely tired in round 3, by the way, but it doesn't stop him from still pursuing with his game plan. But where Hiestand really gets at opponents is when he scores the takedowns, gets his opponent down, and then can just lay heavy on top, because he's a good BJJ player topside as well. But that's where Jake Hadley's strongest. I think if Hiestand takes Hadley down, I don't think Hiestand's going to have his way with Hadley very easily, at least on top. I think Hadley's tricky to deal with. We've seen Darren on top of Hadley. We've seen other good fighters try and remain topside on Hadley. And you can nullify him after a certain amount of time, but it's not easy. And like I say, Hadley's really tricky off his back. He's got submissions, he's got sweeps. And because of that, obviously, he's got a good BJJ game, so he can get back up to his feet as well. But I think where Hiestand's going to get at Hadley is within the wrestling. I think that's where Hadley's going to have difficulty in this fight, because I think Hiestand's a better wrestler. But then to add more complexity into this breakdown, I think Jake Hadley's the better striker, significantly better as well. I think he's going to have power at this weight class. We've seen Hiestand hurt, wobble, dropped. Hiestand can strike as well, but you can tell it's definitely not an area where he's super comfortable. So when you look at this overall, you've got Hadley, and again, this is in my opinion from my analysis, you've got Hadley as the better striker, Hiestand as the better wrestler, but then you've got the grappling that's quite even. So this is why I think the fight's going to be super close, because I think, look, while it's on the feet, Hadley's going to be better, but then I think Hadley's going to get taken down, and then on the ground, it's going to be a bit of a coin flip. So I think the line should be a bit closer, and that's the reason why I'm saying that. Maybe not a pick 'em, but look, I think if there was a slight edge on Hiestand, maybe -120, -125, that's probably more of where Hiestand should be at, where he's at around -150 now, which again, for me, that puts the slight value on Hadley, but I still think I just think Hadley's going to lose the fight. I think that the wrestling is going to matter here. And I think even if Hadley's tricky with his grappling, I'm not sure he's going to be able to completely overrun Hiestand with the grappling. I think at worst, we get a fight that gets stood back up, but then Hiestand goes back to the wrestling again. And I think it's going to be a frustrating night for Hadley. So for those reasons, I'm picking Brady Hiestand to win this fight. And in the next fight, we've got the veterans. We've got Darren Elkins versus Daniel Pineda. And this is a fight that I love to see, because it's very easy sometimes for the UFC just to give fighters like Elkins and Pineda fighters, or opponents, should I say, that are young, hungry, rising up the division, that have got speed and power, and then it's just a nightmare for them. But even with that being said, especially from Elkins' side, he's proved that he can still hold his own against that type of competition. He's shown that he's aging really well, and of course he's on a decline. Of course he gets cut up. He's got a load of scar tissue all over his face, and his nickname's The Damage. It's written across his chest, literally, and there's that side of it. But he can hang with some of the younger fighters. It's just the more fights he has, the more he gets beaten up, the more we want to see him in these types of fights. And the thing is, although Pineda doesn't look it, Pineda's like 38, so or 39, so there's only like a year difference between Pineda and Elkins. So, it's not as if Pineda, although he's actually quite short and stocky, he doesn't have like a massive amount of one-punch KO power. So that doesn't mean that Elkins isn't going to bleed, but it just means that Elkins isn't in a fight where he's just going to get touched and completely banged out. So, yeah, look, I think it's a really good fight. Stylistically, I think it's good as well. Obviously, Elkins, dominant wrestler, or predominant wrestler, shall I say. Very, very tricky grappler to deal with. But then Pineda's also a very good grappler as well. Now, when it comes to the striking, I think Pineda's probably the slightly better striker. But again, it's quite even. It's just if this is a 15-minute kickboxing fight, I'd probably take Pineda if I'm being honest. But with the wrestling and grappling, with it being MMA, I'm kind of leaning onto the Elkins side. The only thing that I do think will be close in this fight and maybe difficult for Elkins is the fact that Pineda genuinely does look quite big, quite strong, powerful. So I don't know if there's going to be a physical edge here. But what I will say with Darren Elkins is he's absolutely one of these fighters that doesn't look like he's going to be very strong and very physical, but he absolutely is. And you've seen him fight and outpower and outmuscle guys that look bigger than him. So you can tell there's some deceptive physical traits there for Darren Elkins. And again, for me, that's what makes it, when you look at Pineda, he looks the bigger physical fighter. But I'm not convinced that Elkins isn't going to be able to have his way with Pineda. I think that if Elkins can get his wrestling and grappling going, I think that's where he's going to be slightly better in this fight, even though Pineda's got a dangerous submission game himself and is a good grappler also. But Elkins is like a real heavy wet blanket on top when he can get on top of his opponents and when he can, sort of blanket them is the right expression, is the right adjective to use. And even if Pineda's standing back up to his feet, shows his back, Darren Elkins is really good at taking the back, getting his hooks in, locking his opponent down and then looking for a submission as well. So I do think it's a well-matched fight. It is closely lined for a reason as well. I do think Pineda's going to be the slightly better striker, but I just don't think the fight's going to be completely reliant on the striking. I think there's going to be a lot of wrestling and grappling, and especially within the wrestling, I think that's exactly where Elkins is better. Probably the biggest gap in skill in this fight as well. So for those reasons, I'm picking Darren Elkins to win this fight. And in the next fight, again, this is a really, really good fight as well. I'm not sure why it's so low down on the card. Definitely main card worthy in my opinion. We've got Matheus Nicolau versus Asu Almabayev. And again, this is one of those fights, like I mentioned earlier on, with Kyler Phillips. Asu Almabayev has paid his dues now a little bit in the UFC, and now they've bumped him up to the top. And look, it's right to do that, and it is a big step up in competition for Almabayev here because the opponents that he's beaten to this date are just absolutely nowhere close to the level of Matheus Nicolau. But the thing is, Almabayev is winning dominantly. His 3 fights in the UFC, 2 decision wins, a round 2 submission as well. And yes, the opponents aren't the level of Nicolau, but he's handling them exactly how you'd expect a fighter that's got a skill set and a quality within the top 5 or 10 of the division. He's handling them exactly how you'd expect that type of fighter to handle them. He's not lost a round in the UFC, and in the 4 rounds that have been completed, he's won all 4, and then obviously in that, one of the fights, he ended it in round 2, won that round as well. So he's not even lost a round in the UFC. He's looked nothing but dominant within his wrestling, within his grappling. He's striking, doesn't spend too much time striking. He knows where he's good. And because of that, he just doesn't get hit. Like, you look at his, strikes absorbed, I think it's like 1 point something per 15 minutes, which is extremely low. But it's also very reminiscent of a striker. And in regards to the wrestling, he's got a 56% completion rate in regards to his takedown completion rate, which, you wouldn't think it's that high, but he is a bit of a chain wrestler as well when he needs to be. And even for a chain wrestler, the 56% is very high. Like, you look at a Merab Dvalishvili, the current UFC bantamweight champion, he's around 35%, I think, his takedown completion rate off the top of my head. So, and look how good he is with his wrestling. So it just goes to show, look, the chain wrestlers do have a lower percentage on the takedown completion rate, and Almabayev is all about that takedown. Now with Matheus Nicolau, so this is where it becomes a good fight because Nicolau's striking's actually really good. He's got power. He's not that active, which is the one knock that I have with the striking. Like I've won a lot of bets on Nicolau. Like I don't think I've lost one on Nicolau actually. I think I've only won bets on him. And why this is a really big deficiency for Nicolau is because I'm sat there with a bet on Nicolau just hoping and praying that he just keeps putting volume out, because he does well when he's striking, but the volume just isn't there. But still, when you're looking at the striking versus striking here against Almabayev, I think Nicolau's the better striker. He's definitely more of a counter striker, so he's not very, pushing on the front foot, putting pressure on his opponents. So this is another reason why stylistically I think there's a problem here in this fight, which I'll talk about very soon. But then you look at the wrestling. Now, the wrestling of Nicolau, it's okay. He can defend takedowns. He can score takedowns. But I wouldn't say he's a dominant wrestler and got super high wrestling both offensively and defensively. He's just good. He's good at the top level, but it's not a predominant style for him. His grappling is where he's really good. So his grappling top side, he can be a bit of a blanket off his back. I wouldn't say he's like a massive submission threat off his back, but he's a good grappler. That's where he's predominantly best, in my opinion. Now, where this is all a problem, in my opinion, for Nicolau. And the reason why is, look, he's not a forward pressure fighter. So if you're going to want to stop somebody shooting takedowns on you, you've got to move forward. You've got to put volume on them. Nicolau's a counter striker. So he's going to wait for Almabayev in this fight, or at least that's what the tape and analysis tells you. So if he's waiting for Almabayev, it's going to allow Almabayev to come forwards, which is going to make the takedowns easier for Almabayev. It's much easier completing a takedown moving forwards than it is moving backwards. So that's problem number one. It's the volume and the fact that Nicolau will be on the back, or likes to be on the back foot. He's got to switch that up in this fight if he's got any chance of winning, because he's got to stop the takedowns. And if he doesn't stop the takedowns, he's going to lose. And then it's the volume as well. So with Almabayev, because Almabayev's a wrestler, his volume is really low. Just like his strikes absorbed is really low, his output's really low because he's always wrestling. So where Nicolau does the best work is when he's got a volume-heavy striker against him, because there's a lot for Nicolau to bite on from a counter-striking perspective. But with Almabayev, he's not going to be putting out a ton of volume. So I don't think Nicolau's going to have a lot to bite on from his counter-striking. And then with the fact he's not moving forwards and being aggressive and putting volume on Almabayev, I think Almabayev's going to get the takedowns he needs in this fight. And I just don't think Matheus Nicolau is going to submit Almabayev or stop the takedowns from coming over the 3 rounds. I think Almabayev, he did show that he got tired last time out, but it was sort of within the last 60 to 90 seconds after a heavy wrestling attack in that fight throughout the entire fight. But in this fight, I just don't think he's going to have too much to worry about with the striking because of Nicolau's striking style. And I think because of that, it's going to allow the takedowns to come, which again is going to be a bit of a nightmare for Nicolau. So with those reasons, I'm picking Asu Almabayev to win this fight. And in the next fight, we've got a really good test actually for the Brazilian here. We've got Brad Katona versus Gene Matsumoto. Now, Gene Matsumoto last time out looked phenomenal against Dan Argueta. Dan Argueta literally put an absolute pace on Matsumoto, just like he does with every opponent he fights, just like he did last weekend with Cody Haddon. And Matsumoto showed a really good level of wrestling defense. He got took down a couple of times, of course he did, but he was getting back up to his feet. He didn't look in too much trouble, from a jiu-jitsu perspective, a grappling perspective on his back. Like I said, showed a lot of patience, didn't panic, didn't mentally break in there, just allowed Dan Argueta to do what he needs to do to have his moments, and then in the break in between them, Matsumoto can have his moments. Matsumoto ended up getting Dan Argueta out of there. And yeah, he was, Matsumoto was definitely a round down and probably losing that second round as well. But the fact is that he didn't panic, he didn't break, he didn't get tired. He just stayed the course, stuck to the game plan and did what he needed to do. So what we know with Matsumoto now is that he's not a fighter that's going to panic. He's a fighter that's very calm, very controlled, that's got a high level of defensive wrestling, very difficult to take down. If you do take him down, it's going to be very difficult to, blanket him on top. He's good at getting back up to his feet. And then with his striking, that's where he's good. That's his predominant style. So now this is a dangerous striker that's got power, that mixes attacks up really well, that's going to be difficult to take down and keep down. This is a fighter, in my opinion, to keep your eye on, because that is the type of quality of a fighter that's going to be entertaining, fun to watch, that's going to get finishers, and that's, again, for the people that don't like wrestling and grappling, you're going to really like this guy. So Matsumoto, definitely one to keep an eye on. Now, this fight, I said it right at the introduction of introducing this fight to this breakdown. Brad Katona is a really tough test because Katona is very good everywhere. He's not someone that specialises in one specific area. Decent striker, decent wrestler, decent grappler. But he's also very physical. He puts it together really well. And I say physical, he's not massive in regards to tall and huge, but he's quite compact, and he's also a very smart fighter as well. Like, even when you hear him talk, and obviously he was on The Ultimate Fighter, you hear him talk, he's very smart. His fight IQ, you can tell, is clearly high. The issue I have with Katona, though, is he always fights pretty close. Like, he'll be in fights against fighters that he should absolutely be dominating, but he'll just find some way to make that fight close along the way. He'll start well, but then just drops off a little bit. So he'll definitely, he'll look good in round 1, and then he'll start to look good in round 2, but then it just slowly drops off and the fight slowly gets closer and closer, and then he's winning, a comfortable 29-28 when it should have been a dominant 30-27 is what I'm trying to say. Now, against Gene Matsumoto is better than some of these opponents that Katona's going closer than he should be going with them. So I do think that Matsumoto is the rightful favourite here. Do I think the line's wide? Probably. But Matsumoto, I think, look, Katona's going to struggle to take him down and keep him down. I think if Katona goes for that game plan and has that path to victory set in his mind, I think it's going to tire him out trying to shoot and trying to grapple with Matsumoto. So then it leaves it open to the striking. And again, I think Katona's going to have his moments, but I think Matsumoto's a better striker. I think Matsumoto will land the harder shots. I think his arsenal's a little bit more varied. I think the quality of striking is a little bit better as well from a technical perspective. So I think this is going to be one of these fights where Matsumoto's doing great work on the feet in a competitive fight. Katona's going to be shooting takedowns, might get 1 or 2, but I don't think he'll do anything with it. I don't think the fight's going to be won and lost with what Katona's going to try and do with the wrestling and grappling. I think it's going to be won and lost with what happens on the feet, and I just think Matsumoto, more polished striker, and is going to be landing the cleaner strikes throughout. So for those reasons, I'm picking Gene Matsumoto to win this fight. And in the next fight, we've got a fight between Joselyne Edwards and Tamires Vidal. Now, this fight, I think, is actually a good fight for Joselyne Edwards from a stylistic perspective, but, historically tells you that these types of fights always end up running close. If there's ever any bit of a surprise from an underdog winning, it's in these types of fights. The judges at the minute are just horrific. There's judges scoring fights to certain fighters that shouldn't be winning the fights, therefore creating close split decisions. And look, the only saving grace with the judges at the minute is the fact that 2 of them are normally okay. 2 of them normally score the fight all right, which I suppose that's the reason why you've got 3 judges. So any dissenting judge that's seeing something completely different is exactly that, just a dissenting judge that ends up, that scorecard ends up not being relevant. So that's the only thing that I can say. But the second that we start getting 2 of those types of judges that are seeing something completely different, then it's going to be horrible. But yeah, look, these types of fights always end up running quite close, regardless of what the betting line tells you. And I am expecting, look, like I say, it's a good fight for Edwards, so I'm expecting her to win. And I would normally be expecting her to win comfortably, but like I say, again, it's going to end up going, if it goes to a decision, it's going to end up being so close, unless Edwards is genuinely dominant, which I do think there's a chance of. But even if she is completely dominant, I still wouldn't be shocked for a judge to score it the other way. But again, enough of the judges. In regards to the stylistic matchup here, look, Tamires Vidal is normally, look, she's quite thick, she's quite physically big for the division, in regards to how stocky she is, not in regards to height. Because look, Edwards is going to have a height advantage here, but where Edwards is tall and slimmer, I think Vidal is short and stockier. And because of that, I think Vidal might have a little bit of a strength and physical advantage in this fight. But ultimately, I think that's where the advantages stop for Vidal, because I think Joselyne Edwards is a better striker. I think she's going to be faster. I think she's going to be landing cleaner strikes. And then when it comes to the wrestling and grappling, even though Edwards is predominantly a striker, and in her early UFC days, she's shown massive holes within her wrestling and grappling, the wrestling and grappling's actually picked up to be somewhat okay. Like, you look at the fight she had against Ailin Perez, she was sweeping Perez, she was getting on top of Perez, she was doing good work on Perez, and Perez should have been the better wrestler and grappler in that fight. And yes, Perez won. I actually cashed a bet on Perez in that fight just because I believe that Edwards was massively massively overlooked, not overlooked, but she was at a significant disadvantage within the wrestling and grappling against Perez, and it ended up again, like I've just mentioned, running so close to the point where we were seeing things in the fight that I was surprised about seeing. So in this fight with Vidal, even though Vidal, she can wrestle and grapple, she's predominantly a striker. But I think Edwards is the better striker, and then I think Edwards is the better wrestler and grappler based on what I've seen against someone like Ailin Perez. I think Ailin Perez is way better in the wrestling and grappling than Vidal, and Edwards held her own against Perez, so I think Edwards will be better than Vidal. And that's currently where I'm at. I think that Edwards is the better striker, the better mover, faster. I think her wrestling's better, or her takedowns are better, shall I say. I think her grappling's better. I think Vidal's going to have a physical advantage that's probably not going to factor in too much, but like I say, I wouldn't be surprised to see this fight, go to a close 29-28 split decision or something like that, even if Edwards is dominant. But for the sake of this pick and prediction, I'm picking Joselyne Edwards to win this fight. And in the next fight, we've got Jessica Penne versus Elise Reed. And again, talking about close fights and fights going to a split decision, again, this is one of these types of fights, regardless of who you think is going to win and how confident you are. The likelihood is if it goes to a decision, it's going to be probably a close split decision again, with one judge seeing something that he shouldn't be seeing. So, yeah, look, Jessica Penne, 41 years old. It's hard to be overconfident in her, if I'm being honest. And even at 41 years old, she's had a lot of cancelled fights as well. Not all of them have been her fault, but the majority of them have been her fault, whether that's an injury, illness, undisclosed, pull out. There's a lot on Penne's fights of a record of cancelled fights, and at 41 years old she's on a 2-fight losing streak as well. It's just hard to be confident in her. Now with Elise Reed, it's not as if the UFC have given Jessica Penne someone that's going to absolutely run through a steamroller. Elise Reed is good in her own ways. She's a good MMA boxer. She's got a bit of wrestling and grappling if she needs it, but even Elise Reed, she's 31, so, she's it's not exactly like Elise Reed's an up-and-coming 26, 27-year-old. She's 31, but even still, with that age gap, we're looking at 10 years, even at 31, between 31 and 41. And, yeah, I just don't know. It's going to be a really close fight, because I think, look, Penne's style, if this was like 6 years ago, and I know it's easier said than done, and it's really easy to come up with this type of analysis, but I think if you're looking at 5-6 years ago, I think Penne absolutely steamrolls this version of Elise Reed. But the decline's there, there's question marks there, and although Penne's still got a decent style, she can be got at. And I think Elise Reed, for nothing else, she'll come forward, she'll put a boxing together, she'll land combinations, she'll go to the body and the head, and I think that's probably going to be enough to just put Penne on the back foot, just to land on her as well. I think Penne probably will look to try and tie up with Elise Reed, get a trip, get her down to the mat, and that's where Penne's path to victory is. I think if she can get Reed on her back, I think Penne can do good work on top, but I think that Elise Reed is the more trustworthy fighter at this moment, just because, like I say, she's not 41 on a 2-fight losing streak and has got like around 7 to 10 cancelled fights in the last few years. And that's the other thing as well, Penne hasn't won a fight in nearly 5 years now as well. So yeah, it's tough. It's tough to be confident in this fight in general. It's tougher to be confident in Jessica Penne due to where she's at in her career. So for those reasons, I'm picking Elise Reed to win this fight. And in the next fight, we've got another fight that could end up razor close as well. We've got Alice Ardelean versus Melissa Martinez. Now, Alice Ardelean made a UFC debut against Shauna Bannon not so long ago. I'm sure it was at the UK event. And she made a decent account of herself, Ardelean. She got a couple of takedowns. She was in and around, I think she was down by about maybe 15, 20 strikes to Shauna Bannon. So, look, she was in and around the numbers, and she got a couple of takedowns, and it was a split decision. It was close. And like I say, the account of herself was made. But, look, I don't think Shauna Bannon has been, the absolute sort of hyped, dominant fighter that maybe some people were shouting about her pre-UFC. She's okay. She's done an okay job since coming into the UFC, but I just think that there was a little bit too much hype on her. And look, that might still come. Sometimes the first 2 or 3 fights in the UFC are tough for a UFC fight. We've seen it so many times before. And then the good fighter ends up shining through and then goes on a win streak and starts looking great. And Bannon like I say, she's young enough to be able to still put things together and do good things in the UFC. But right now, like I say, I just don't think she was living up to some of the hype that she was getting shouted about her. And yeah, look, I'm still not 100% sure where Ardelean's at because of that. Like Melissa Martinez on the other side. Martinez has come from a kickboxing background. Again, very highly touted coming into the UFC. Gets into a UFC debut against Elise Reed and gets beaten in a fight that, in my opinion, it was a good fight for Martinez. And the thing is with Martinez, she was 2 years. There was a 2-year layoff before that UFC debut from a previous fight, and now there's been a 2-year layoff from that fight to this fight now. So again, she's super young, so again the developments and improvements should be there from fight to fight. But what's she been doing in the 2 years? I hope it's been working on the wrestling and grappling, because once that's patched up, I think she could be a really good fighter in the UFC. But again, we just don't know. So what we've got here is we've got an Alice Ardelean who I'm not 100% sure on exactly where she's at from a skill set perspective. Is she actually a really good fighter that sort of had a bit of a tough debut, short notice, that will benefit more from a full camp? And she got a couple of takedowns. Can she, is that wrestling good enough to get those couple of takedowns in pretty much most of her fights? And then you've got Martinez on the other side, who's got a kickboxing background, clearly deficient in her wrestling and grappling, that's had a 2-year layoff, that also had hype coming into the UFC and hasn't really lived up to it. There's just so many question marks on both sides. It's hard to be super confident here. So when it comes to a pick and prediction, I'm just going to pick the fighter that I think has the more skills in a specific area, which is Melissa Martinez. I know Martinez is a good striker. I know that she's going to be a better striker than Alice Ardelean. It's just, what I don't know is Ardelean actually, a decent fighter herself and is going to benefit from this full fight camp and be able to get takedowns just like she did in her last fight. Because if she does, then this fight's probably going to be on the table for Ardelean to win. If the takedowns aren't there for Ardelean, then I think Melissa Martinez looks great against her. So it's just a tough one, because I thought Martinez was going to look great last time out against Elise Reed and didn't. But again, UFC debuts can sometimes be a little bit tricky for fighters, especially in a fight where they have a good stylistic matchup. I spoke about it last week with Cody Haddon and Dan Argueta. I thought the same thing was going to happen there, but it didn't. But maybe Martinez just dropped that first fight, UFC debut, in a fight that she should win, and will now go on that win streak that we've seen happen a million times before. Maybe. But yeah, look, there's a lot of question marks in this fight. There's a lot of uncertainty. But for the sake of the pick and prediction, I'm picking Melissa Martinez to win this fight. And finally, the last fight to break down, we start actually the night with the heavyweight division. We've got Robelis Despaigne versus Austen Lane. Now, of course, with Robelis Despaigne, really poor performance last time out. I was actually one of the betters of Robelis Despaigne. And look, there's a lot of people that talk shit on people that bet Despaigne in that fight. But look, Despaigne has got a huge path to victory in every single fight that he fights in. Massive path to victory. Like if he'd have gone in there against Waldo Cortez Acosta, landed a hard punch and sparked him out within, sort of 30 seconds, 60 seconds, then everybody would have been like, oh yeah, that was a great bet. That was always going to happen. But because it was the flip side to that, and Despaigne didn't land that punch and then got wrestled and grappled by a guy that we've not really seen wrestle and grapple too often in the UFC. Suddenly it was an awful bet, and everybody that bet him, doesn't know what they're doing, or however people are wording it. But look, the bottom line is it ended up being not a good bet. Because, I think I got him actually at like minus 175. He went up to like minus 250. I got him at like minus 175. And so I did beat the line. But realistically, because of how we saw the fight play out, the line probably should have been closer. So I will mark that down as a bad bet. But anybody that's talking shit on anybody that bet Robelis Despaigne to win that fight, I hope that those people have never made a bad bet in their life. But I guarantee they have, and multiple times. So it's just one of them. It didn't work out for Despaigne then. But I'm back on the Despaigne bandwagon this time, which is funnily enough. And look, he's a minus 450 favourite, and there's absolutely nothing that you can do with that from a long-term gambler's perspective. You know, if you're trying to look for value and beat the bookies long-term, there's nothing you can do with Despaigne at minus 450 here. I'm not sure what the props are. Potentially look for a KO prop, because it's likely he's not going to win a decision anyway. Or, well, not win a decision, but it's likely not go into a decision. So maybe look for the under 1.5, which I'd imagine that's where the totals are set at. Maybe look at Despaigne to win by KO if you're wanting to bet this. Like I say, I've not looked into the props yet. But yeah, look, I think that Austen Lane is providing a serviceable opportunity for Despaigne. I think the UFC have matched it accordingly. Again, I feel that the UFC are still going to try and build Despaigne up whilst he's working on his defensive wrestling and grappling. Like the same happened to Ngannou. Look at Ngannou when he fought Miocic. I know it was at a higher level, but, you know, he got ragged all about and, you know, couldn't do anything with his striking. I think the UFC are putting Despaigne on a similar course, but doing it at the lower level, starting lower level, whilst he's building up in the division. But I think, look, I don't think Austen Lane provides too much of a threat here from a wrestling and grappling perspective. Bear in mind what we saw with Despaigne last time out. I wouldn't be shocked if Austen Lane did shoot a takedown and Despaigne struggled to get back up. But look, it's not Austen Lane's predominant style. He's more of a striker. And he doesn't come from a mixed martial arts background himself anyway. I'm sure it was like American football or something that he played before he came into the UFC, before he came into MMA. So it's not as if Austen Lane's been wrestling since he was, you know, a young kid. So yeah, I think it's going to be a striker versus striker, and I think that Despaigne is more athletic. I think he's got more power. I think he's going to be faster, and of course he's an Olympic striker as well with Taekwondo. So yeah, I think that Despaigne's going to have a massive striking advantage, speed, movement, power. I think Lane's going to have to go to the wrestling and grappling, but, you know, I haven't seen too much of Lane wrestling and grappling to have any sort of, you know, analysis of, oh yeah, if he gets a takedown, then Despaine's done and he can't get back up, just because I don't know. So what I do know is that both prefer to strike, both hit hard, but Despaigne's a better quality striker that's faster and more powerful. So for those reasons, I'm going to pick Robelis Despaigne to win this fight. And that's all for this episode of the podcast. As always, thank you all for tuning in. Thank you for listening. If you're on one of the podcast platforms like Spotify, Amazon Music, Apple Music, feel free to jump over to our YouTube channel where we can have a conversation, drop a comment, tell me who you're betting on, tell me if we disagree on a pick. I always try and get back to everybody in the YouTube comments. I do have a busy week from week to week, but like I say, I'll always try and make the time to come and reply to anything. And of course, if you are on YouTube, please drop a subscription to our YouTube channel as well, because it really does help. And one last time, if you're wanting to jump into the betting action this weekend, then make sure you do so at MMAplay365.com, where we've got something for every type of gambler. Our packages are super affordable, as well as our ethos is to make sure that you're not spending too much money on the subscription, so you can win that money back as quickly as possible, so you can start profiting on your bets as quickly as possible. And of course, all our subscription packages come with Bayes AI, our UFC prediction software as well. So that's all at MMAplay365.com. I'm Newsome. Thanks for listening. I'll see you again next week.